right, chapter 198, A Gloomy Visitor. As soon as the two young ladies had reached the farmhouse, Ellen addressed Catherine with alarming seriousness of manner. "My dear friend," she said, "some plot is in existence against your peace. That fearful-looking man and that horrible old woman are perfect fiends in mortal shape." "But what cause of enmity can they entertain against me?" asked Catherine, drawing her chair close to Ellen's seat with that sweet confidence which a younger sister would have been expected to show towards an elder one. "I never saw them before in my life, to my knowledge, and I certainly never can have injured them." "You are rich, and that is a sufficient motive to inspire the man with designs against you. You are pretty, and that is sufficient reason for inducing the woman to spread her nets in your path. The man," continued Ellen, "has more than once attempted the life of our generous benefactor Richard, and that old hag, Catherine, is a wretch who lives upon the ruin of young females." At this moment Mrs. Bennet entered the room, and observing the disturbed countenances of Ellen and Catherine, she felt alarmed. Ellen immediately communicated to her the particulars of the adventure just related, and concluded with these observations. "The person of the man was previously unknown to me, but Mr. Markham had made me familiar with his name. Thus, when I heard that name breathed by his infamous companion, I recognized in him the monster of whose crimes my benefactor has related so dread a history. As for the woman," added Ellen after a moment's hesitation, "she has been pointed out to me as one of those vile wretches who render cities and great towns dangerous to young females. Indeed, she once practiced her arts upon me, hence I am well aware of her true character." Mrs. Bennet was dreadfully frightened at the incident which had occurred, but, like Catherine, she was somewhat at a loss to conceive what possible object the two bad characters whom Ellen so bitterly denounced could have in view with respect to her young charge. The trio were still conversing upon the mysterious occurrence when Farmer Bennet entered the room. Of course the narrative had to be repeated to him, and he was much troubled by what he heard. The dinner was served up, but none of those who sat down to it ate with any appetite. A vague and uncertain consciousness of impending danger or of serious annoyance oppressed them all. The table was cleared, and Mrs. Bennet had just produced a bottle of excellent homemade wine to cheer their spirits, as she said, when the servant entered to announce that a person desired to speak to Mr. Bennet. The farmer ordered the individual in question to be admitted, and the servant, having disappeared for a few moments, returned, ushering in an elderly man dressed in shabby black, wearing a dingy white cravat with very limp ends. "Your servant, ma'am, your most obedient, young ladies," said he. Then, starting with well-affected surprise, he said, "Ah, if my eyes don't deceive me in my old age, that's Miss Kate Wilmot, verily and true." "Mr. Banks," said Catherine, in a tone expressive of both surprise and aversion, for she remembered that the undertaker used to call upon Smithers to purchase the rope by means of which criminals had been executed. And you'll remember the Resurrection Man talked about his friend Banks from Globetown, who could help them out with all this. He was the one that was going to drive them out there. So this is part of the same scheme. "Yes, my dear, my name is, as you say, Banks, Edward Banks of Globe Lane, London. Furnisher of funerals on new and economic principles. Good deal coffin, 8 shillings and 6 pence. Stout oak, 35 shillings. Patent funeral carriage, £1.11. Really, sir," exclaimed Mr. Bennet impatiently, "this is not a very pleasant subject for conversation. If you have come upon no other business than to recite your prospectus—" "A thousand apologies, sir, 1,000 apologies," interrupted Mr. Banks, calmly sinking into a seat. "But whenever I see a few or a many mortal vessel gathered together, I always think that the day must come when they'll no think more than blessed carcasses. And then, Mr. Bennet," added the undertaker, shaking his head solemnly and applying a dirty white handkerchief to his eyes, "how pleasant to the virtuous feelings must it be to know where to get the funeral done on the newest and most economic principles." "Catherine, do you know this person?" inquired the farmer, irritated by the intruder's pertinacity in his gloomy topic. "I have seen him 3 or 4 times at Mr. Smithers' house in London," was the answer, "but Mr. Banks well knows that I never exchanged 10 words with him in my life." "Then you do not come to see Miss Wilmot?" demanded Mr. Bennet, turning towards the undertaker. "No, sir, no," answered Banks, heaving a deep sigh. "Did you not perceive, sir, that I was quite took at a nonplussed when I set my venerable eyes on the blessed countenance of that charming gal? But pardon me, sir, pardon me if I am somewhat long in coming to the point. It is, however, my nature to ramble when I reflect on the pomps and vanities of this wicked world, and nature is nature, sir, after all, is it not, ma'am?" Here he turned with the most dolorous expression of countenance toward Mrs. Bennet. "I really do not understand you, sir," was her laconic reply. Nor more she did, good woman, for it was not even probable that Mr. Banks quite understood himself. Now, sir, you will have the goodness to explain the nature of your business with me, since it is with me, no doubt, that you have business to transact, said the farmer, in a tone which showed how disagreeable the undertaker's whining nonsense was to him. Something tells me that this man's visit bears reference to our adventure of the morning, whispered Ellen to Catherine. Do not offer to leave the room. Let us hear all he has to say. Catherine replied by a meaning look, and then glanced with suspicious timidity towards Banks, who was again speaking. My business isn't to be explained in a moment, sir, said the undertaker, and I must beg your patience for a little while. Go on, exclaimed the farmer, throwing himself back in his seat and folding his arms with the desperate air of a man who knew that he could only get rid of a troublesome visitor by allowing him to tell his story in his own way. You're in mourning, ma'am, I see, observed Mr. Banks, turning toward Mrs. Bennet. I remember that vexatious affair of the rector of St. David's. Pray, ma'am, who undertook the funeral of your blessed defunct sister? Sir, exclaimed Mrs. Bennet, tears starting into her eyes. No offence, ma'am, no offence, only I should like it to be known in these here parts that Edward Banks of Globe Lane, London, undertakes on new and economic principles and doesn't mind distances. Suppose, sir, continued the most disagreeable visitor, again addressing the farmer, suppose you come to me some fine morning and says, Banks, says you, my dear wife has just become a blessed defunct. This is too much, said Mr. Bennet, starting from his seat. Have you or have you not any business to engage my attention? I'm coming to the point, I'm coming, said Banks. Pray sit down for a few minutes. I shan't engross much more of your valuable time, for time really is valuable in this sublunary sphere. And the undertaker shook his head so mournfully that worthy Mrs. Bennet could not help thinking he was a very good and humane, though somewhat prosy individual. When we look around us and behold how many benighted creatures lives in total recklessness for the future without putting by in an old stocking or anywhere else a single penny towards buying him a decent coffin, it's enough to make one's hair stand on end. But I see you're growing impatient, sir. Well, perhaps my feelings does carry me away. Still, I don't mean no harm. Howsomever, business is business, as coffins, or carcasses as carcasses, and so here's to business in a jiffy. With these words, Mr. Banks drew from his capacious coat pocket a brown paper parcel about a foot long and 3 inches wide and as many deep. Then he began with most provoking deliberation of manner to unroll the numerous folds of paper in which the precious object of so much care was wrapped, and while he thus aroused the curiosity of his spectators to the utmost, he continued talking in a more lachrymose style than ever. There is duties which we owe to heaven, and there is duties which we owe to our fellow creatures. To heaven, man, we owes the obligation of virtue. To our fellow creatures, we owes respect and decency when they're no more. Virtues, ma'am, is like the white nails on a black cloth-covered coffin. The more there is of 'em, the stronger is the coffin, and the better it looks. Vices, ma'am, is like the knots in a common deal coffin. The more there is of 'em, the weaker is the coffin, and the worse it looks. I am now going to show you, ma'am, and you too, sir, and you also, young ladies, an object of the deepest interest to us poor mortal vessels. I've wrapped it up in this wise because I've patented it, and this is the only model I've got. When once it's generally known, the whole world will thank me for the invention, and posterity will remember with gratitude the name of Banks of Globe Lane, furnisher of funerals on new and economic principles. You see, the parcel's getting smaller and smaller because the blessed object was as well wrapped as a young baby. However, here's the last fold with the paper, and there's the concentrating focus of all interests. As Mr. Banks wound up with his beautiful peroration, he disengaged from the last fold of paper a miniature model of a coffin about 8 inches long and wide and deep in proportion. It was covered in black silks and was studded with innumerable white nails. But as he placed it with a glance of almost paternal affection upon the table, the farmer started up, exclaiming, I have already put up with your insolence too long. What does this unwarrantable intrusion upon my privacy mean? Speak, sir. Have you anything to say to me? I am now coming to the point at length. In one word, he continued, producing a small memorandum book and preparing to write with a pencil, in one word, I want you and your family to let me put down each of your names. For what? Demanded Bennet impatiently. For a patent silk-covered, silver-nailed, indestructible, wood-seasoned coffin, was the calm reply. It's warranted to keep as good as new till you want it. Mr. Bennet fell back into his seat, completely stupefied by this extraordinary announcement. Mrs. Bennet cast horrified glances at the undertaker as if she thought he was mad. Ellen cast a look of deep indignation on the individual who had produced this excitement, and Catherine started on her seat, exclaiming, What have you done, Mr. Banks? Mrs. Bennet is fainting. This was really the case. Such an effect did the sudden display of the coffin and the cool demand of patronage made by the undertaker produce upon one whose mind had not yet quite recovered from the severe shock occasioned by the murder of her sister. "Water, Catherine, quick!" exclaimed the farmer, hastening towards his wife. Kate instantly hurried from the room to fetch water, while Ellen, on her part, proffered the necessary attentions to the fainting woman. Mr. Banks was thus for a moment forgotten, and this was exactly the condition of things that suited his purpose. Hastily thrusting the model coffin into his pocket, he seized his hat and hurried from the parlor, closing the door behind him. In the passage he met Kate, who was hastening back to the room with a jug of water in her hand. "One moment, only one moment, as you value the memory of your deceased mother," whispered Banks, speaking more rapidly and with less whining affectation than he had done for many years. "Take this note, read it in private. Its contents deeply concern you and your blessed defunct parent. If you breathe a word concerning it to a soul, you will forever lose the opportunity of knowing who was your father." Banks thrust a note into the girl's hand and hastily left the house. The words which he had uttered produced, as might naturally be supposed, so strange an effect upon Catherine, that sudden allusion to her mother took her so much by surprise, and then that mysterious mention of her father increased her bewilderment to such an extent that she mechanically grasped the note with a mixture of awe and gratitude, and, prompted by the same impulses, thrust it into the bosom of her dress. All this was the work of scarcely a quarter of a minute, and the moment she had thus received and concealed the note, she re-entered the parlor, where the aid of the fresh water soon brought Mrs. Bennet to herself. "Where is that scoundrel?" cried the farmer, now finding leisure to think of the cause of his wife's sudden indisposition. "He is gone," returned Catherine. Then, seating herself near the window, the young girl fell into a profound reverie. "Gone," said Bennet, "but it is better that he should have gone, or I might be tempted to do him a mischief." "That man came hither with some sinister design," said Ellen. "From the first moment of his appearance, my suspicions associated his visit with the adventure of the morning." "But what object could he have?" cried the farmer. "He seemed only anxious to intrude himself as long as possible." "Perhaps he was waiting for an opportunity to speak to Catherine alone," observed Ellen. "He certainly appeared to be talking against time." "Yes, dear friends," exclaimed Catherine, rising from her seat and advancing towards those whom she thus addressed, "that man did desire to speak to me alone, and he succeeded in his object. Pardon me if for a few moments I hesitated whether to obey his solemn injunction of silence or to communicate the incident to you who wish me well, but the words which he spoke and the earnestness of his manner bewildered me. It, however, only required a short interval of sober reflection to teach me my duty." Catherine then repeated the words that Banks had whispered in her ears, and produced the note which she had thrust into her hand. "You have acted prudently in revealing these particulars, dear Kate," said Ellen. "A man who is compelled to effect his purposes by such low devices as those employed by him who has just left us cannot mean well." "Let us hear the contents of the letter," cried Farmer Bennet. "We may then, perhaps, see more clearly into the mystery." "Read it, Ellen," said Kate. "I must confess to a profound curiosity to become acquainted with its contents." Ellen accordingly opened the note and read as follows: "Silence and secrecy, if you respect the memory of your deceased mother. Be not deluded by the advice of Miss Monroe, who has her own reasons for prejudicing you against me. I am well acquainted with all the particulars of your birth. I can impart facts that it behooves you to learn. You will bitterly repent any distrust in this matter. Have you no inclination to hear more concerning your mother's history than you can possibly now know? Would you not go far and sacrifice much to glean something with regard to your father? This evening, at 7 precisely, I shall be at the foot of the hill where I met you just now. If you come alone, you will learn much that nearly and deeply concerns you. If you appear accompanied by a soul, my lips will remain sealed. Signed, the female you saw just now." "I have so far my own reasons for counseling you against that wicked woman," said Ellen indignantly, "as much as I would save you from danger. But if you really believe that there can be anything serious in this promise of important communications, I should advise you to meet that female, for precautions can be adopted to protect you from a distance." Catherine glanced inquiringly towards the farmer. "I see that you are anxious to meet this woman, Kate," he said after a pause, "and it is natural. She promises communications on subjects that cannot be otherwise than dear to you. Miss Monroe and I can keep watch at a distance, and on the slightest elevation of voice on your part, we will hasten to your assistance." This project was approved of even by the timid Mrs. Bennet, and Catherine Wilmot anxiously awaited the coming of the appointed hour. Okay, that's the end of the chapter. So I'm assuming that Catherine is going to go meet with the old hag. Whether or not we're going to be allowed to hear what the old hag tells her, I don't know, but I want to know because this has been a big mystery in this entire volume. Okay, we'll see.